everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hey, Rob. It's me, Diana. Still 2023.
And it's me, Jackie. Still 2023.
It's going to be for a while, folks.
Yeah.
I've actually skipped over 2023, and I've started writing 2024 and
I have
stuff.
too.
And I will look at expiration dates and be like, oh no, it's about to expire, but it's actually 2024. 23. It's just doesn't roll off the tongue.
Same.
You know?
And also, what I love, I'm going to hold this because I can't look at you.
She's very passionate.
I think I'm so passionate. is I was looking at mayonnaise the other day, and the expiration date was May 2023, and I was like, it's done.
Right.
It's not even May
Chuck
yet.
this.
And
That's
Matt was
great.
like, don't throw that away. I just bought that.
That's awesome.
Okay, bye.
Wow.
2024, I'm very excited. 24 is one of my favorite numbers. It's divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 12, and 24, which really gets me going.
So these sound like leisure activities. Counting dates.
Mayonnaise purchasing.
Looking at dates. Deciding to throw things out. Throwing them out. These sound like
Thinking
either
about the
leisure
divisibility
activities.
of numbers.
Environmental events that could function as reinforcers for all sorts of exciting
Clearly do,
life
'cause I'm,
behavior
still
for the both
talking
of you.
about it. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, while this isn't a podcast necessarily about expiration dates and when food goes bad or calendars, it is a
Maybe it
podcast
is.
about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research, where every week we pick a topic and then we discuss relevant research articles describing that topic and phenomena. And you know what? I think given that you're all into these weird, idiosyncratic leisure activities that make function as reinforcers, why don't we do an episode all about reinforcement, specifically how leisure reinforcement or leisure items that function as reinforcers maybe could be better used in our field than, say, edible reinforcers? What do you all say? Does that sound like a topic?
My segue was going to be, maybe it's time to put an expiration date on edible reinforcement. I am actually very passionate about this topic, and so I was the one that wanted to bring it up. And maybe I am being a little bit preachy, but I also think this is an important conversation for our field to have. And there's a lot of nuance, and we will discuss the nuance, but it is a good starting place to talk about this.
Sounds like edibles are really the best, and we should all get as many edibles as possible. They're super fun.
Yeah, I'm not denying that because edibles are delicious and great. But there are some considerations I think that we should take when we talk about using edible reinforcement specifically. So, of course, for everyone, reinforcer selection is going to have to do with our own learning histories or their effectiveness and our current levels of deprivation. Also, there are factors related to the availability of those reinforcers, the practicality of their use, and then their overall efficacy as well. So long in our field, we've used preference assessments to help identify stimuli to utilize as reinforcers. And we have an entire technology with respect to how one might do that. But we do also need to recognize that a lot of that research has been done with edible reinforcement. And I don't want us to get off on the wrong track here by saying that we are against the idea of utilizing contingencies to promote learning, because you have to have contingencies to produce learning. All of us have learned everything that we know through contingencies, right? That is the science of human behavior and learning, and not even human, all behavior and learning. But if we are looking to have behavior maintain in generalized settings, we want to ensure that the reinforcers that are being used in those settings are as naturalistic and embedded within the environment as possible. So we want to be keeping in mind what we're adding on as additional layers of reinforcement versus what reinforcement can be sort of built into the natural occurring environment and still functioning as a contingency, of course, but in such a way that we can more easily fade out any added reinforcers that might be present and see behavior continue to maintain in those settings. So that's one piece of things to consider here. And then the other piece is it's, not always, but also not uncommonly occurring that edible reinforcement is utilized for these types of learning patterns for individuals with developmental disabilities. I'm not the only person, but some people say that using edible reinforcement can be problematic. We are adding in additional caloric-laden foods into someone's diet.
Even Skinner said that, just putting it out there.
So not only me,
Yeah. Even
your
Skinner.
number one authority, but also Skinner, who knows a little bit about behavior analysis. Just kidding, guys.
He doesn't know anything about behavior analysis?
No, I'm kidding that I'm your number one authority.
No.
Yeah. Thanks, Jackie. So we're adding in these calorically heavy foods into someone's repertoire, and then we're also changing the overall relationship potentially with food as well, right? So we're making food contingent on other things that are occurring that can really kind of mess you up with regard to how you think about food. Same thing, dietitians say the same thing too. You don't want to only, make your kids eat like everything on their plate before they get dessert, because then that sets them up for overeating and for valuing dessert or like highly, sugary foods more so than foods that might be more nutrient rich. Additionally, if you're going to use edibles as reinforcement, then you run into the issue where you might need to restrict access to those edibles as well in order to make them function in a state of deprivation. And so that can be problematic too. I have seen it occur in the past where once edibles are introduced as a potential reinforcer, and we'll talk about this more, it really makes all other reinforcers kind of fade in comparison, right? So I don't know if you guys have seen that happen, but once there's an option for an edible, many individuals will select that as the reinforcer that they want, which is understandable because, like we said, edibles are delicious. No denying that, but it can then displace those other reinforcers and make them not be selected or not function in maybe the same way that they did previously. I said that that's like a genie in the bottle kind of situation, right? So once you let that out and use edibles as reinforcement, it can be a challenge to go back from that. And it's also possible that in some settings you can't use edibles as reinforcers, which is fine. But if you have a client who's really dependent on those in order to see the behavior that you're looking for, then that may limit what maybe less restrictive settings they're able to access as well. It's costly to use edible reinforcers, and it also lacks social validity with the general population as well. So these are all factors that I think we should be thinking about when we are selecting reinforcers, and I might encourage everyone to think about these pieces. If they have the option to move away from edible reinforcement, these might be some reasons why.
I definitely agree with moving away from edible reinforcers. Hopefully, when working with a client, finding that they have a robust repertoire of play skills or activities, or even if we don't necessarily consider them sort of like generic play skills, but interaction skills with a variety of sort of sensory type items, so that we're just using leisure items and access to higher quality attention. Those will be our reinforcers that we'll be using in our treatment plan. But I do always, have that concern with some of our learners and many of our clients, especially ones maybe that engage in more severe rates of problem behavior or already have, very limited or restrictive patterns of engagement with the environment. There's always that concern that I'm sure many listeners share, and I'm gonna prop it up here a little bit as a straw man argument just to get the episode going, but.
Is that a Nick Cage movie?
That's The Wicker Man, nor is it a Nick Cage movie. That is an older movie. There is a remake by Neil LaBute that is supposed to be terrible. I've never seen the remake, but the original, The Wicker Man, is a classic, one of the preeminent folk horror films that started that genre.
Guess what? Never saw it.
Nobody saw it. It was really hard to find. It
wouldn't be surprising that I have not seen it.
No, and that's not a movie I would be like, oh, Jack, you must have seen The Wicker Man. I'm shocked.
Okay, proceed.
Anyway, you might be thinking of Straw Dogs, which is a separate movie. No.
I wasn't thinking about any of that.
No, all right. But it seems like coming into, getting ready for this episode, what are the prevailing articles about edibles? Well, when you put edibles and leisure items together, like you're already talking about, all the research points to edibles win, and nobody cares about leisure items when edibles are in the mix. Therefore, I guess we have to use edible items. And then even the question of, but maybe it doesn't play out that way in skill acquisition. And then even those results are kind of mixed. Some studies, prior side are the ones we're going to talk about today, pointing to like, you know what, actually, leisure items are just as effective as reinforcers as edibles. And then other studies saying that's not actually true. Edibles are way better than leisure items. Or it seems, the results seem to be all over the place, which I think leaves the average person who is in the same mindset as we are of, we want to move away from edibles, sort of saying, but if we want to move away from edibles, but clearly edibles are more effective reinforcers in many of the ways that we would measure effectiveness of reinforcers, what's a behavior analyst to do? And I think in the articles we'll be talking about today, we really have a chance to sort of look at some other factors that, if you're just looking at, say, the preference assessment literature, may not be readily apparent in terms of the directions that you yourself as a practitioner could go. So, Diana, what are the articles we'll be discussing today?
We have 4 articles that we will either review or touch on for this episode today. The first is titled Stimulus Preference Assessments and the Utility of a Moderate Category by Ciccone, Graf, and Ahern. That was published in Behavioral Interventions 2006. Next, Effects of Magnitude on the Displacement of Leisure Items by Edible Items During Preference Assessments by Clark, Call, Simmons, Scheithauer, Muthing, and Parks. That was published in Behavior Modification 2020. Next, Comparison of Edible and Leisure Reinforcers by Fahmy, Iwata, and Jan. Published in Java 2015.
My favorite 70s band, Fahmy, Iwata, and Jan.
What about the Blue Jean Committee?
Yeah.
And finally, and this one I think we'll just bring into during our dissemination station, a review of environmental enrichment as treatment for problem behavior maintained by automatic reinforcement by Gover, Fahmy, and McCown. That was also in Java 2019. Nailed it. All
right. Well, let's start with the Ciccone, Graf, and Ahern article, sort of looking at stimulus preference assessments and that moderate category. Or as the kids would say, that mid category of reinforcer.
They do say that. I read a Huffington Post article about teen slang, so I'm all up to date.
What other teen slang is there?
Sus, that's bad.
Oh.
Yep. Cringe, also bad. Mid, not particularly good. Drip, that means your clothes look nice. Fashion, that also means your clothes look nice.
Oh, man, I would think that drip was not that your clothes look nice.
Yeah.
Like, when I would say he's such a drip, that's
right.
like not
That's
great.
like a 50s way.
Because I'm really old.
I will try to sprinkle some more in.
Okay. So this article is short, sweet, and without graphics.
Okay.
Yeah, I know, right?
I was
Threw
like,
you a bone on that one.
let me look at the graph. What?
So the teens today would not be into this article without all the graphics.
It's sus.
Right,
It's sus. Yeah.
No, it's mid, actually. It's not that bad.
I think it might be drip.
But
Incorrect use.
I thought it was hilarious because I was like, I always like to look at the graphs first, so I scroll down past the references, and then there was nothing, and I was like, what? And I thought it was hilarious because it was early in the morning, and I picked my computer up and looked around it, are they on the back?
Oh, geez. Oh, wow.
They weren't there.
You forgot to print that page.
There's a table, and yeah. So we talked about this, right? Preference assessments help us determine preference, and preference may or may not lead to an item being reinforcing. I don't think we've talked about that yet, but we are right now.
Not today.
Not today, but in the past we have. When we talk about pairings, just a precursor. And so here, previous research suggests that if you do one preference assessment, some higher order or higher ranking items may mask the preference of other moderate to low preferred items. And so they were like, oh, maybe we should look at that. And so an extension study demonstrated that even low preferred items may have reinforcing properties for less complex tasks when they're not in competition with those moderate or highly preferred tasks. So this study wanted to just look at moderately preferred items and low preferred items and see whether they were preferred or not. So they combined and extended the results of the previous studies to determine whether or not moderately liked items were more likely than low-ranked items to be identified as highly preferred on follow-up preference assessments. 7 individuals, they ranged in age from 15 to 21, at a residential school in Massachusetts.
Oh, I know that residential school in Massachusetts.
And remember, this was written in 2006, so there's no demographic information. So here, the students had a lot of exposure to lots of preference assessments, probably every 6 months if I had to gather, and they could follow simple directions. So I love preference assessment literature, but also it baffles me because there's never an experimental design, and I always search for it. I'm like, what's the experimental design? It's another thing I look for. I'm like, it's a preference assessment. So there is no experimental design here. I guess it's replication. Right? You're just repeating the results over. There is none, really. But every time I'm reading like preference assessments literature, I'm like, where's the design? And I'm like, nope, there's not one, which is interesting. So there's not one. So the dependent variable is approach, which is making physical contact with the item. And so the participants had 3 MSWOs, multiple stimulus without replacements, where across 7 items. So they put all the set of items right in front of the participants. They were very specific to say it was 0.5 centimeters away.
Which they have to be, as we all know, with your preference assessment.
Right. And so once an item was chosen, the participant could consume it because it was an edible, right? And then they moved everything to the right, and the last thing went to the front. And then they got to choose again.
Yep.
They did that until there's only one left, right, for all 3 preference assessments. And then they used the results to create a preference hierarchy. And this is one of the biggest reasons why I'm excited to read this article, because I always tell people what the preference hierarchy is: 80 to 100% for high preferred, 50 to 79% for low preferred, below 50 for, moderate is 50 to 79, low 50 is low preferred. I always tell people that, but I never knew where. I'm like, yeah, people taught me that, but I have no idea where it came from. Pace 1985, babies. Woo!
Single stimulus.
But now I have that, so now I can put it in it's going to be like a resurrection. I'm going to put it in all of my new published preference assessments. But it's funny, I teach it to students, we talk about it, and they're like, they never ask where it's from. But now I'm going to tell them. And feel good about it.
Preference assessments are one of those technologies that they've just been around long enough now that I think most people are like, well, you just taught me to do a preference assessment. Where did you get it? The book of how to do preference assessments, I suppose. It's not it's not quite as close temporally as like, oh, well, the MSWO that just was published in the literature in 97. It's kind of far away from that. It's like, yeah, you just do it.
Yeah, you just do it.
It's in a pamphlet or something. I don't know.
But now I'm happy to have that, because now I'm not just pulling it out.
It is fun. It is fun to remember all the things that we just sort of take for granted. These are facts versus, no, this is just more research.
Yeah. So I feel great about that. So the first MSWO, they had 7 edibles that participants had encountered before they ran it. They threw the highly preferred away. And they took the moderately preferred and put it through a second MSWO. And then with some some random other edibles that participants across the school
just sort of had.
I like that. Another thing I like about this study is they don't tell you what the edibles were. They just say they're preferred, moderately preferred. They don't tell us what. I just want to know: is it Cheeto? Is it Swedish Fish? What is it? And you know what? The Doritos company really wants to know too, for advertising purposes. So in the second MSWO, 3 participants had 2 items that were identified as moderately preferred. 3 participants had 3 items that were moderately preferred, and 1 participant had 4 items that were moderately preferred. So they had a total of 19 moderately preferred items. Then, the third MSWO took all of the low preferred items from the first and did the same thing by just pulling some edibles around, and they assessed that. So, fascinating enough, they still had 19 low preferred items. Do you think that was a coincidence? They're both 19.
I think it's a coincidence.
Okay.
Probably.
I was like, I reread that like 3 times. Obviously, I read this early in the morning.
It's the law of preference, Jackie.
And I'm like, did they plan that? Like, did the experimenters plan that both of them would be 19 items? I don't think they did. There's no graph, only a table. Just so shocking. So 7 out of 19 items moved up in that second preference assessment from moderate to high, and only 1 of the 19 items that was ranked from low moved up to high. 5 out of 7 participants identified additional preferences when they reassessed those moderate preferred items. Only 1 in 7 participants identified additional preferences with those low. So I guess the main point of this is preference may be masked when other items are around.
Yes.
We should be tracking and assessing our moderately preferred stimuli because we could get more utility out of them. Could be resulting in false negatives. But no reinforcer assessments were conducted, which was a super bummer for me because we all know that preference doesn't equal reinforcing assessment.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
Yep.
But that wasn't, this was like a 3-pager. So if you're bored and you have 5 minutes, maybe you're pooping and you need to read an article, this one's for you.
Great. Just where everyone wants to be.
Frank Ciccone will
He's going to appreciate it,
that.
yeah.
I'm going to text him and be like,
This is how, we recommended your article for quick bathroom breaks.
oh, man.
And speaking of breaks,
Speaking of pairings.
why don't we take a little break ourselves right now so everyone can just go read this article wherever you want to. And then we'll be right back talking more about moving away from edible reinforcers. We'll be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
And we are back talking about moving away from edible reinforcers. But before we continue our discussion of the relevant research, I want to remind our listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE and QABA approved. By listening to the show, you're able to earn 1 learning credit. All you need to do is finish listening, then go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, and click the Get CEUs button. You can also click the link that is in your podcast description page on your podcast player. It has a direct link to the page. Enter in some important information, including 2 secret code words. I'm going to give you the first one now. It is butter. Butter. It's a dairy product. Is it a highly? I think one might say that it could be considered an edible reinforcer in that it is paired with a lot of delicious, highly preferred items such as the aforementioned cookies. You could just eat butter, I guess.
A lot of people have a story about eating a stick of butter.
I've never wanted to do that.
I've done it.
But I haven't.
No.
But Jackie has.
Butter
I
on a
think
bread. I do that.
I bet 1 out of 3 people has eaten a stick of butter.
I've eaten butter. I've eaten butter when I was a little kid. I used to be obsessed with butter, and this is wicked creepy and gross, and I can't believe I'm telling you. But I've already started, so world.
There's no way to stop it and not record this audio forever.
It's okay. I used to steal butter from the fridge and then go into my cabinet and get those bay leaves.
Oh,
I would wrap the butter in bay leaves and then take it and hide it and eat it like behind the couch where my mom couldn't find it. And
I don't know that those are edible.
They're
bay
not,
leaves?
They're not supposed to be.
You take them out. They're for flavoring, and then you remove them.
Yeah, but I used to eat them. I used to wrap it in butter.
A lot of roughage in that butter stick.
And my mom would she had to, so far that it was so bad that she'd have to put it at the highest shelf. Mm-hmm. And she had to put the bay leaves with the alcohol because I would steal them and eat them. This is like when I was like 7 or 8, which is, but also gross.
Yeah.
Like a nutrient deficiency?
Who knows?
Yeah, it sounds like some sort of and then they found out you had a disease in which you needed copious amounts of bay leaves or
I don't, but it stopped, luckily. I no longer.
You're not doing that anymore?
Yeah.
That's good.
Code word, butter.
Butter. All right.
I'm glad everyone in the world that listens to this podcast now knows. that I used to eat butter.
Well, maybe they don't. Maybe they're like,
it.
they don't
I love
like,
it,
they just
actually.
like listening for fun. They're like, I don't really need CEs. And they skip through that little code part and they miss the whole story. All right. Just messed up their routine or their 30-second skip. Okay. Well, let's continue talking about moving away from edible reinforcers. So I'm going to discuss Fahmy and colleagues' article, which at the end of the day really is just a replication and extension of all the other articles that had been published. Maybe not all of them, but a lot of the other articles that had been published sort of looking at that displacement effect and getting those sort of mixed results in terms of, but are edibles really better reinforcers than leisure items or play or sensory items?
Well, I think the idea here is if you can't do it first, do it right. Do it in the most thorough way possible.
Yes.
And
So
that's
this is one of my least favorite write-up articles in that it's got multiple studies within one article, which I do not like. It's no fun. I like one study, one article.
It's
And you're like, wow, that was so short.
In there.
It's only 3 pages. Why don't you write 3 studies? Just write 3 different studies. 3 3-page studies would be great. I don't know why. It's psychological. So, and we mentioned at the top of the show that there had been previous research on this. So like DeLeon had looked at, combining preference assessments with edibles and leisure items, and sort of one of the earlier studies being like, look at this. The edibles always displace the leisure items, or they seem to always displace the leisure items. Then there have been some studies in the 80s and even the 70s sort of looking at the delivery of the various types of reinforcers and, does one do better than the other, and, direct competition. And those are kind of the mixed results. So Fahmy and colleagues said, let's just do all those studies and we'll do them again. And then we'll have maybe not the final word, but we'll have the sort of more up-to-date word on this effect. So study 1, basically just replicating, what if we took a bunch of edibles and a bunch of leisure items and we threw them in one preference assessment, what'll happen? Study 2 looked more directly at what if we used a bunch of leisure items and a bunch of edible items in reinforcing acquisition of some like response chain. So something harder than it's been in the previous research, but a pretty simple response overall. And then study 3 said, what if we took leisure items and edible items and used them as reinforcers for some sort of like easy motor task, and then looked at maintenance over time? Like maybe one, is one better at one of these aspects of, simple learning than the other? And what will we find out? Wonder if they sort of were hoping that they'd find that and leisure items actually outperformed edible. And I mean, it pretty much comes out that edibles, at least in these very specific situations, sort of come out on top, though again, not as directly.
But not always.
No, not always, and not as directly in the sense of we're doomed, folks. You can't get away from edibles; they're the best reinforcers, and that's all anyone wants. Certainly not the case. But starting in study 1, they have 12 individuals diagnosed with autism or intellectual impairment, or some intellectual disability. And they just had a bunch of sort of arbitrary edibles chosen from the various, sweet, salty, sour kind of categories, similar to ones that they already were familiar with. And then they also took 8 leisure items that had some sort of a sensory characteristic. And the OT at the center they were working at or consulting with or doing research with had just recommended these kind of cover the various types of sensory modalities that typically are, noted as preferred. So they have an auditory or a visual or a tactile component to them. And then they sort of looked, all right, will our participants approach these items by either making contact with them, by consuming them, and they took the items that was applicable to, and they said, now it's time for preference assessment. So they did an MSWO, similar to the one, Jackie had described. Some of the things that they had to do, though, and I think this comes up a lot in the other research, is they made sure to hold time consistent, because this is going to be a factor that we see in some of the other articles, that when you think about edible reinforcement, what happens? You grab the edible, you shove it in your mouth, and you eat it in about 3 seconds. Mm-hmm. Whereas with leisure items, you have the leisure item, you don't eat it, you're sort of just playing with it, and you interact with it for some period of time, usually like 15 seconds. I hope you don't. That would not be.
No, you can consume things that you don't eat.
What?
I don't understand that one
Stop.
either.
We're not doing that.
You don't? Okay.
That's like we're not getting into the spirituality of leisure items on the show today. That's a different episode.
That's my spin-off show.
The spirituality of leisure items.
Oh my gosh, that would be amazing.
With a soundtrack by Wada and Jan.
I was going to say Enya. Who can save the...
Well, those are the exact lyrics. Great.
Only time. That's the only part I know.
That's the one from Lord of the Rings, isn't it?
I don't know. That's Enya.
Oh, or is that one for Titanic?
It's Enya. I don't know. We're Enya. Enya's in a lot of things.
Oh, no, she didn't do Titanic. That's Celine Dion. Sorry. Anyway. So we've got our inter-trial interval, which
Yes.
is going to be a common thing.
Time is an issue.
Because, again,
Yeah.
time is going to be an issue, and we'll see that time kind of does play into edible versus leisure a little bit. So you have 15 seconds, whether you eat the item or play with the item, you got 15 seconds before you get presented another trial. So that was held
Your
consistently.
choice, what you do with
And they did a number of these MSWO preference assessments until they got the 4 highest edible items, referred to as HPE, a highly preferred edible, and 4 leisure items, referred to as an HPL, which is a highly preferred leisure item. Then they said, all right, we got our 4 top leisure and our 4 top edibles. Let's do another 5 MSWOs. And they did. And what they found was what other people had found, in that edible items were ranked higher than all the leisure items for about 67% of the 12 subjects. And if you only count one time, there was one leisure item that was ranked higher than an edible item, then edibles were higher than all but one leisure item for an additional like 16% of subjects. So, the majority of subjects ranked edibles higher than leisure items, with 2 of the subjects having kind of mixed preferences. It was also found that the 48 leisure items that had been sort of chosen and used in these preference assessments were selected a lower percentage of trials when the assessment types were combined than when they had been presented, well, not individually, but solely as leisure or solely as edible, which was not true for all the edibles. It was true for only about 40% of the edibles. So it did happen to some edibles as well that they were scored lower, but it was definitely not as much as it was for the leisure items. So it looks like if you combine your edible and leisure assessments, you're going to get high rates of selection for edibles and low rates of selection for leisure. And does this mean that leisure items are low preference and edible items are high preference? Well, I mean, at least in the context of the preference assessment, yes. But does that mean that they are ineffective? Leisure items, therefore, would be ineffective. Don't choose them as a reinforcer. Study 2. What if we take 4 subjects from study 1 who showed different patterns in their preferences? So 2 subjects who loved edibles and 2 subjects who had mixed response to edibles and leisure. So kind of to just change it up a little bit, and taught them a Lego building TA. And
All Legos.
All Legos.
Yeah.
So what if we took some Lego structures and we rotated the high preference edibles and high preference leisure items from the combined preference assessment, and we sort of switched which building item was receiving which reinforcer for the various steps being completed, and we had a little multi-element design, right? So each structure, one structure is going to be paired with rotating cast of HPE, one structure with a rotating cast of HPL. Does one reinforcer type win in terms of speed of acquisition of Lego building?
This is right up your alley.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. Direct
Versus
2 preference assessments. Two edible. No, I'm not even getting that part right. 2 reinforcer types enter. Can only one leave? No, they're kind of just all smushed
They
together.
both leave.
Nobody wins.
They
You're
both
all a bunch of
win.
losers. 3 subjects showed that their acquisition patterns were pretty much the same, regardless of whether they were their behavior was reinforced with edibles or reinforced with leisure items. 1 actually had one structure that he learned much faster with edible items, and a different structure that he learned much faster with leisure items. And then they kind of went into that, and he seemed to have some strange idiosyncrasy about how he liked to build Legos that probably played into that. But they could only say that really it didn't seem to matter which item was delivered, which modality of reinforcer was delivered. Learning occurred. Okay, that's fine. They had some thoughts as to why that could be. Maybe it was because they used prompting, which I don't know. That didn't really seem like a strong argument as to why this might have occurred. So finally, in study 3, does one of the reinforcer types matter in terms of maintenance over time? So if you're, it doesn't seem to matter which you use, but over time, does one of them sort of lose its luster? And so they take 6 participants from study 1, and they taught a very simple motor response, like pressing a button and putting the chip in the bank. Actions I usually think of for actual basic reinforcer assessments. Put the ring on the film container, touch the card, right? And they started by training each participant to engage in some response with, on an FR1 schedule with either edible or a leisure, and then they'd increase the requirement over time. They train one response with one reinforcer type, then they train another response with another reinforcer type, and then they do these kind of maintenance conditions where they would either just present 10 target responses before you get 15 second items to an edible, or 10 target responses when you get 15 second item with a leisure activity. They started with a multi-element design, and then if they didn't really see any difference in kind of rates of responding, they do like a reversal. So they just do, more like kind of like, repeated exposure to edible or repeated exposure to leisure. And when they started this experiment, they were doing 5-minute sessions, and 5-minute sessions didn't seem to really matter for 5 out of the 6 participants. One of the subjects did show a much higher rate, like a double rate of responding when edibles were delivered in this 5-minute condition, but everyone else kind of just, I'm pressing the button, I'm putting the film canister on, whatever reinforcer you got sounds good. But when they did increase these sessions to 15 minutes in that kind of reversal design or those sort of extended exposures, then you did actually see that 4 out of the 5 remaining subjects showed a much higher rate of responding with I don't know if much higher, but it definitely was a higher rate of responding. It wasn't actually that much higher with the edible condition. One of them had about equal rates. So it did seem like when looking at longer and longer sessions, edibles may be in some ways superior to leisure items in terms of maintaining higher rates of responding. But it wasn't like, the rates of responding for leisure items like totally bottomed out or anything. There was some evidence of satiation for leisure conditions and a little bit more stable, stabilization of rates with the edible conditions. So there may be some sort of a satiation factor. Again, it's possibly due to sort of, the time or the magnitude of reinforcement you get from getting an edible versus getting a leisure item. You may satiate because you just have that long length of time with that leisure item, which you don't have with the edible.
They yoked the length of time of the session?
In terms of the presentation of the... yes, they did.
Okay.
Man, I love a good yolk.
Oh, yeah. Egg yolk, ox yolk, schedule yolk, they're all good.
Yeah, it's a YOKE, in case anyone out there is not sure.
I don't care how you spell it. It's my favorite homophone. So if you had to make a snap judgment from these 3 studies, I guess edible items might be slightly more preferred and might maintain responding a bit longer, but it's not like leisure items don't function as reinforcers and don't maintain decent levels of responding. So again, perhaps, edibles have a place, and we're not saying get rid of edibles altogether, but it's not like we're going to be doomed or our clients will be doomed if we make a switch from edibles to leisure, or we plan for leisure occurring at some point in that learning chain of events. And now let's route our last article we're going to discuss. This is an article that I know, Dinah, you're going to talk about, but this is one of those articles I read, and it was one of those, like, what a great idea. It's sort of like we're talking here about, how do we compete? How do edibles compete with leisure items? Is there a way that we could measure this better? And it just is one of those kind of pretty simple, pretty straightforward. I never would have thought of it. I don't think most people would have thought about it. But once you read it, you're like, oh, yeah, no, of course. That's it. That's the way.
Yeah.
How did you know?
Yeah, it is cool how they put this study together. So it's the Clark 2020 study, and they were really interested in the phenomenon. Dun, 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 dun.
Sorry.
Phenomenon that has existed and been known about for a while of displacement of leisure items by edible items in preference assessments. So this dates all the way back to De Leon et al. 97, and then a second one, Bojack and Carr, 1999, in which this is exactly what they found. They did an edible preference assessment. They did a leisure preference assessment. They then did a combined preference assessment of the top items from each, and almost virtually every single time, the edibles won out. So they took all of the highest preferred slots in the preference assessment.
That's a theme. We've talked about this over and over. That's just how it goes.
I like those high slots.
Yeah, I like those odds. So everyone said, well, obviously, edibles are more delicious than toys, and so we will use edibles from here on out because we want the highest, most effective reinforcers.
And thus the first commandment of ABA was written, edibles only.
Yeah. So they said there's a couple reasons why you might see displacement. Sure, it may just be that they are more delicious, but it could also be, and this is an opposite of what the FAMI study said, Rob, was that edibles might be more subject to satiation over time. So it could be that you see displacement early, but if you ran that out over time, that you would actually start to see satiation with edibles. That's not what your FAMI 2015 said.
But I mean, it wasn't like they were running this over a span of years. It was just these, longer sessions in terms of, chunks of time.
Yeah. So
seemed to have the opposite.
The question probably still remains as well, but that's something to consider. And then, the other thing they said is maybe it's just quote unquote inherently easier to extract reinforcement from edible items, whatever like that might exactly.
It's faster, right? You're like,
it's faster.
You feel it in all senses. You feel it on your hands, in your nose.
There's like a
mouth.
chemical reaction in your brain when you take in.
I think that's what they're saying, but I like how they say it.
I know.
Extract it.
Yeah.
It's like you got to get a syringe, it's
like
your
playing-
Oreo.
It's like playing Operation.
Yeah. So when you're thinking about over time, like how long it takes to consume the reinforcer, edibles are going to give a bigger, quicker punch because you take it in right away and it's there. You've done it. You've ingested it. It's presumably reinforcing. But it does bring up the question, is there a way to equate across these two different classes of stimuli what actually functions as equivalent amount or magnitude of reinforcement, right? How can we quantify between the two? Because they're obviously very different. So if we say, okay, well, clearly just giving this leisure item for, 10 or 15 seconds or whatever was done in the De Leon original studies made the leisure items lose out, because how much can you really enjoy something for 10 to 15 seconds? Not that much, especially, and I know not for De Leon, but like later studies. There's a Steinhilber and Johnson one more recently too that looked at iPad use, and you give a kid an iPad for 10 seconds, you barely get it booted up. Mm-hmm. You can't enjoy a video game in 10 seconds.
You can't enjoy anything in 10 seconds, right?
Yeah. It's going to be aversive when it gets taken away.
Right, you get it booted up and it's like, la, la, la.
And they're like, my turn.
I extract no fun from that.
Yeah.
I need a good 57 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
57 minutes. That's a long time.
That's my full-length episode of the show that I watched.
Right, so 10 seconds, like that's not really cutting it, but is there a point at which access to a leisure item is going to equate to the reinforcing efficacy of the edible? What were you going to say?
No, I just had a great idea for a study talking about equating magnitude, because Jag was saying I need 57 minutes. I was like, we just watched Abbott Elementary, like 22 minutes. Like, that was a lot of fun. I had a great time. What if we yoked, like, how much of like a crappy show that I don't want to watch would I need to be allowed to watch to equate like a shorter amount of time of television? Or would it just become more and more aversive the longer you force me to watch the show I didn't like, right? TV preference assessment. That's like
right.
Put that in People Magazine.
Are
That
you
sounds like
stuck
a real.
in the middle place with only a copy of what did they have? The middle place.
I don't remember.
It's something terrible. Yeah. I don't know what it is.
It's like Major League 2 or something.
Yeah, I think that might be. Nice job, Rob.
That's a reference for The Good Place.
Yeah,
show. I do know that one.
I said it for you, Jackie.
Thanks. I never get references.
Okay, so what if you looked at longer access to leisure items to try to determine if they might move around in the preference hierarchy, and in doing so, could we actually determine at what point have we provided enough access to them that they start to equate with the reinforcing or potential reinforcing magnitude of the edible item?
Pop.
Yes, exactly. So that was the purpose of the study, to determine if displacement of leisure items continued to occur when the duration of the leisure item access was increased. There were 3 participants. Zach was 10, Laura was 21, Lewis was 9. They all were diagnosed on the spectrum. And they did 3 things. They did a displacement assessment, magnitude training, and then a magnitude assessment. So I'll tell you about each of those. The displacement assessment was just like what I just described for De Leon. 3 separate preference assessments were conducted: edibles alone, leisure items alone, and then a combined format. The edibles and leisure items were individualized for each participant here. So they didn't use that system like you had in yours, Rob, where it was just like,
what do we got?
8 things. Yeah. So that was already, to me, a plus.
I don't think they were always the same 8 things. They just were things in the environment.
Similar.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they did this via a paired stimulus preference assessment as well. And then the combined format, was the top 5 from each. So then in that one, they had 10 stimuli. So first they did that. Then they did magnitude training. And the purpose of magnitude training was to make sure that the participants, when they later on were going to select between the different items, were sensitive to the differential reinforcement magnitudes, as well as how they were displayed. Too, because they had to get kind of creative in what they did here. So
yeah, this feels like the kicker in terms of the theory behind how you would measure this is such a great idea, but it's such a weird, arbitrary means of doing so that I'm glad they added this. If they sort of just jumped right to it, I'd be like, great idea, but how do you know this means anything?
Yes, I know. This is all just preference assessment too, so that's something to consider as well. So then they presented the stimuli on cards. They ended up doing this both for the edibles and for the leisure items, but in the magnitude training, it was just the it was just the leisure items. Each card that was out on the table represented 30 seconds of access to the item. So when the individual selected the card, they then got the 30 seconds of access. So if more than one card was presented, they helped them learn that each time you hand it over, you get 30 seconds, you hand the next one over, you get 30 seconds, and on down the line. So you got 90 seconds of access, but it was represented on the table with 3 cards.
Clever.
Right. So you could physically see this is more of this thing.
The stack of time I have.
Yeah.
I like that.
And it is kind of tricky to think about how you're going to conceptualize that. So I thought that was pretty clever. So they had 3 phases here. They had a small magnitude training, which was just 1 card, a large magnitude training, which was 3 cards, which equaled 90 seconds, and then discrimination training. So the small and large training were just 5 trials. They just had them practice 5 times for each of those. And then discrimination training, they had 10 trials, 5 of each, the small and the large. And then they showed them both options. So they said, do you want iPad with 1 card or do you want iPad with 3 cards? And had them pick one. And once they selected the large magnitude 3 times in a row, then they were ready for the next phase because they assumed that meant that they understood that was the bigger option and everyone, of course, wants more. Right?
I want more.
Yeah, me too.
Certainly in America.
But until I don't.
Right.
But initially,
But I want
always
90
do.
seconds.
Yeah.
That's not really that long.
Yeah.
So
That's true.
Okay. And so then they did what they called the progressive magnitude assessment. So in this, they had it was a modified preference assessment, and it was all represented on the cards. Now they had cards with edible pictures and cards with leisure item pictures, and they paired up the edibles that displaced the leisure items in the combined assessment and the top leisure item. So there's only 1 leisure item ever used, and they did it like a preference assessment. So would you like the Skittle or would you like 30 seconds of access to the towel? They went through all of that. Every time an edible was not selected, it was kicked out. It lost. It was no longer in the rotation. And they did it with the 30 seconds access and saw if any edibles were kicked out in comparison to the highest leisure item. Then they ran through it again and they upped it to 60 seconds. So 2 cards for the leisure item. Then they did it again all the way up to potentially 5 minutes. That was the ceiling. So it would have been 10 leisure item pictures for comparison. All right.
10 minutes with the iPad doesn't beat Raisinets, then get out of town, iPad.
That's right.
Raisinets are the king.
And the magnitude at which the leisure item was selected over the edible was called the switch point. All right.
I love switch points.
But then they thought the same point that you brought up previously, Rob, is, well, you could really mow down a lot of Skittles in 30 seconds, right? So you could potentially go through that assessment way quicker and access probably a greater magnitude of reinforcement just because it takes less time to consume it. So let's add in this yoked rate of assessment in which they compared same items, right? They went through it again, the edible card versus the 1 leisure card, 2 leisure cards, etc. But if the edible item was selected, they got the edible item, but the next trial didn't begin until the same amount of time had passed as they would have had access to the leisure item. So if they had 1 card with a Skittle and 1 card with 2 cards with basketball on it, which was Zach's preferred, thing, and he selected Skittle. He got the Skittle, but then he just sat and waited for 60 seconds until the next opportunity. So the idea here is that it equated how quickly reinforcement could be accessed. And so that was the last thing that they had a comparison between. In the results, the displacement that they expected to see occurred for all participants. Everyone picked those edibles higher or almost always higher than the leisure items.
Not surprised.
No, exactly. No one was surprised.
Because we've seen it in every article we talked about today.
We all love to eat, man.
I love eating.
So for Laura, the 5 edibles were highest, and then her highest leisure item was a towel that she brought from home.
Love that. Maybe
Yeah, whatever she likes, I guess.
Squeeze it.
I know. Yeah.
Don't forget to bring a towel.
Yeah, I know. So that was what she liked. For Zach, his highest leisure item was tied with the lowest edible. That was the basketball and hoop combo. And for Lewis, same situation, but now it was a large piano. How large? Don't know. Just large.
Like a baby grand.
I don't know. Like large means to me like very large, but maybe they mean like, I don't know, honestly, a keyboard. Okay. And then they did the magnitude assessment, and they told us what happened both for the regular one and the yoked one. But the differences are not that great, to be honest. Now, for Laura, her data are different. She had 3 edibles that never had a switch point. Even when she was offered 5 minutes for the leisure item, nope, she still wanted the edible.
Go, girl.
And that was Diet Coke, Diet Sprite, and Skittles.
Wow, she is one of my friends, like, besties, because that is what one
their
of my
favorite?
friends would choose. I'm not going to say
You
who.
gotta put the
but
Skittles in the Diet Sprite, get real.
Yeah, then
taste
it changes
sensation.
color in the
Yeah,
bottom.
for
It's cool.
birthdays, that is what I buy them.
Aw, nice. Well, Laura's right there with them. You should have her come next time. So for her, that like those did not budge. It did not change in any of the assessments, which I respect.
I'd pick Diet Coke over towel any day.
And then for the other 2, which were Sweet Tarts and Doritos, they did have a switch point. It was much higher in the non-yoked assessment, which makes sense, right? When she actually had to wait the amount of time, it was 60 seconds for Sweet Tarts and 30 seconds for Doritos before she was like, actually, I would prefer the towel, please.
Would they nacho cheese or Cool Ranch?
It did
I don't
not.
remember if they mentioned.
It did not specify, which is also
Nacho
important.
cheese.
And then for Zach, his regular assessment and then the yoked were like pretty similar. For the regular one, it was 120 seconds. So once he had access to the basketball hoop for 2 minutes, he picked it over the edibles.
That makes sense.
Not even that long, right?
No.
2 minutes is like a great amount of time to play basketball.
Yeah.
And then for the yoked assessment, it was even a little bit lower than that. The range was like 1 minute to 1.5.
Yeah.
Or I'm sorry, 2 minutes. And then for Lewis, same deal. His results were a little more variable. For the regular assessment, it ranged from 60 seconds to 150 seconds, which was fruit roll-ups and raisins, respectively. And then for the yoked assessment, it was 30 seconds to 90 seconds of access to, what was his favorite thing?
Gold.
The large piano, of course.
Oh, yeah.
And that was goldfish and fruit roll-ups / sun chips. They were tied. All right. So that's what we know. When you actually give access to the leisure item for the amount of time that you could presumably engage with it meaningfully, they do start to compete. You don't see the same type of displacement. So our argument that only edibles really function as effective reinforcers is potentially fallacious. I also would like to note that Laura was the one who was really ride or die on the Diet Coke. She was also an adult, right? So she was 21. The other guys were 9 and 10. So she has a much longer history with respect to receiving these items as edible reinforcers. And I think that that may play a role in it too. So if you at home are listening to this and you're like, I work with older folks and they have this whole history of edible reinforcement, I 100% respect that could be very challenging to change. But for folks who work with younger individuals, I would highly encourage you to consider these data.
All right.
Yeah.
I love that. Now someone just needs to do the follow-up where they combine like, your traditional preference assessment and this sort of magnitude assessment into one stop shop. And then you got yourself a real good,
Oh my God.
a real good little article.
Love it.
I don't know how you would, I guess you could do it with like,
You could.
you have different stacks
Yeah.
of the item. Oh, what if, copyright me, so you can't steal this idea because I'm recording it right now.
Are you going to do it, though?
Yes, as far as everyone is concerned, I'm totally
Okay.
going to do this. Yeah, actually, this seems very doable. I could see it just being a total disaster and then never publishable, but
Sure.
what if you just took the cards, you just did the sort of magnitude, do the children or do my participants understand the different magnitudes, and you just had cards of each of the items, which again, they've done in preference assessment literature. We've even talked about that. But what changed is you added the potential switch points, but the edibles always would be one card.
Yep.
The leisure items, you would stack more and less cards, and then you just sort of run multiple either paired stimuli or MSWO
Right.
with
The
all
way
these
they did
different
it, where they
stacked
kicked them
cards.
out once they were not selected, they were
Yeah.
out.
So you would just sort of have these like various, like a mountain range of cards, and you'd see at what point does the child pick, iPad beats Cheeto, but I got a stack of iPad cards,
Yeah.
right? And then you would have a little bit more of an interesting ranking of, okay, I know iPad loses to Cheeto for 30 seconds. 5 minutes of iPad totally beats Cheeto. So you could put together like a really elaborate preference assessment and then use that information to say, okay, where might I want to use Cheeto? Maybe for something where I do need to deliver reinforcement immediately, or it's a very new skill, but I might save the iPad for, tasks that require 5 minutes of work so that they get 5 minutes of the iPad. But I can't give them 5 minutes of the iPad in between step 1 of my TA chain because we're never going to finish building our Lego tower, whatever the task might be. So there you go. How's that sound? Interesting?
It sounds good to me. And I like that you've also included a measure of reinforcing effectiveness as well, because that was missing from the study, which was
That's
the
part 2.
limitation.
That'd be study 2, but I wouldn't call it study 2. I just put it in as a separate phase of my study. I'm not going to confuse my readers by saying, oh, there's only one study. Psych, 2 studies. Enjoy.
Psych.
No way,
Thought you
man.
were done.
I'm going to use headers. It's going to be very clear. What do I not like about published articles? You don't have enough headers, and you have multiple studies within one study. Don't like it. So there we go.
Let's move into this dissemination
Let's
station.
do it. Into dissemination station we go.
Quiet train.
Yes.
Quiet
So
train.
electric.
No, 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 no.
So to sort of sum up, I think we're all very hot on the idea of we've got to be looking at ways to use more leisure items as reinforcers and keep moving away from edibles. But we understand the concern or the fact that edibles tend to be more preferred in sort of your standard vanilla preference assessments. We understand that edibles aren't necessarily better performers in terms of, the reinforcement battles, though they may have some advantages when we talk about maintenance or response rates, though, again, not so high that we wouldn't move them away or we couldn't move away from them. We also know that we maybe as a field haven't been looking at magnitude as closely as we need to. I'm sure everyone would say, well, of course the child will pick 10 minutes of the video games versus one tiny, Dorito dust
10
particle.
Dorito dust.
10 minutes of Doritos.
Oh, man.
Yeah, that's too many Doritos.
I'd go for it.
And then they never eat Doritos again.
That bag would be done.
So we know that magnitude can play a part, but how do we measure it? Well, we've got one way we talked about here that we could maybe look at magnitude more specifically. But I know, Diana, you wanted to talk about this article by Gover and colleagues from 2019 about environmental enrichment in general, sort of as a talking point or as a sum up. So we won't go into the article itself. It basically just sort of looks at environmental enrichment as a treatment for automatically maintained problem behavior and how it is on its own not usually that effective. You typically need to do sort of some package treatments with some sort of a consequence-based plan, maybe some data pointing to kind of similar with the Clark study, maybe with younger children, environmental enrichment alone may be more effective. And as individuals grow, if you haven't treated some of that automatically maintained behavior, you probably are going to have to use a lot of systems. Maybe you need to have more training in terms of actually how much is the environmental enrichment manipulated or used by the participants versus just existing in the same space as them?
Is this a question that
No,
you're
I'm very quickly trying to sum up the article because you just said I want to use this as our discussion point and you did not elaborate. So I'm not sure what aspect of the environmental enrichment study you wanted to discuss, because I'll be honest, I read this and it was a very interesting article, but I wasn't quite sure how you were tying that into
Because I
moving
think
away from
that
edibles.
Moving, as we have this conversation, and we're saying, let's move away from edible reinforcement, you could also hear folks say, maybe we should be moving away from this type of overtly presented, prescriptive, contingent reinforcement entirely, right? Because it's very artificial. It's potentially stigmatizing. It can be hard to fade out. It can set up weird power dynamics between teachers and students, etc. And I think that there's a time and place for it, right? But we should always be thinking in that way about what is this looking like, and what is my plan for fading this out? You should always have a plan. If you've added in extrinsic reinforcement, you should always have a plan on how you're going to fade that out and how you're going to move maintenance of that behavior over to generally and naturally occurring reinforcers as much as possible. I just wanted to include...
And there's never just bowls of Doritos.
No.
What if they're at a party?
Right, unless.
Yeah. So I wanted to include this just for that reason too, because I think that, I mean, as I said at the top of the show, contingency-based learning is a very real thing, and that's how behavior works, honestly. So we don't want to move away from that as a really building block of how we make changes to behavior when we want and need to. But we also shouldn't discount the idea of ensuring that we have enriched environments in the first place. And that is an antecedent manipulation that's not contingency based, but it can be an important part of the big picture. So certainly older studies, like in the way back times, that was one of the first things they looked at was, what does this environment look like? And are we seeing challenging behavior occurring just because it's a really stark environment with no type of engagement opportunities for this person? And that's a reflection of what the institutions look like so very long ago. So hopefully clients are not underneath those sets of conditions currently, but we should also continue to think about what is the overall access to reinforcement or reinforcing / preferred items as in general when we're entering into new scenarios. And if we're seeing potential challenging behavior occurring or lack of learning or lack of interest, it could be related to the environmental arrangement and the enrichment that's present in that environment or not as a big picture. So I thought that this article tied into that because it's looking at environmental enrichment. And I know it's a different behavior, right? Because this is looking at automatically reinforced challenging behavior. But in the cases that they looked at, they found that just environmental enrichment alone was efficacious in 40% of the cases.
And that was they defined efficacious specifically as like an 80% decrease in the rate of the automatically maintained problem behavior.
Yeah. And that's not everything, but that's quite a lot. But just by making changes to the environment. And so I wanted to bring that up as maybe a counterpoint to this discussion that's talking specifically about contingency-based reinforcement.
That makes more sense now. I was sort of wondering,
You could have asked me before.
Well, I wanted to save this hot discussion. I wanted to save this hot fashion drip for our discussion today.
You're like,
it would have
I
been
have no
sus
idea.
otherwise.
Oh, that was so cringe.
Sorry.
I think it was just mid.
I'm just streets behind. What can I say? But I think that is a very good point, Diana, in terms of looking at environmental arrangement. It almost makes me think of, when you look at a lot of, like the Greg Hanley, today's ABA work, and what if we just had great environments where individuals, as much as possible, had access to all the stuff they loved? Then the only problem behavior you have to worry about is less the problem behavior, and then I'm contingently delivering other items based on other behavior, and you're more teaching the flexibility and the comfort and the potential enjoyment that can come from engaging in other types of activities. So presenting those activities rather than I need to teach you these activities and here's your contingent edible reinforcement, because it's the only thing that competes with all this other stuff you have access to.
Talking about HRE, it's always environment enrichment, pretty much, right? It's not edible based. I think there's a lot of research that could be conducted in this area, like you just had that epiphany of there, Rob. But, my other takeaway is I have done a lot of work in early intervention areas, and we all rarely, if ever, used edible reinforcement. I think the same is true across other types of naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions. It's pretty rare to see that. So if you have the opportunity to work with younger populations and you could be the person who doesn't introduce edible reinforcement, right? And doesn't create that genie out of the bottle situation for that client. And I hope that if you're in that position, that you can review this research and think about what else you could do.
Yeah. I think sometimes, especially you see less edibles in schools because there are not a lot of edibles available. If you want edibles, you got to buy them yourself, or you got to ask the family of your client to deliver them. When you've got a lot of toys, though, well, great. You just naturally, this is what we got, and you don't have to worry as much about that displacement effect when the edibles only happen at lunchtime.
Great point.
Yeah. So maybe it's a moot point in some settings out there, and people are saying we never use edibles. I don't know what you're talking about. But trust me, they're there, folks. All right. Well, we hope you all enjoyed listening to our discussion about moving away from edible reinforcement. Thank you so much for listening. If you like the show, and we hope you did, we would love it if you subscribed on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you like to get your podcasts. There are a couple other places online you can find us. You can find us on all the socials as ABA Inside Track. You can find us on YouTube with the YouTube subtitle feature available readily. We also have transcripts. If anyone ever does need one, please reach out. We're able to get those. You can go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, to find links to the articles that we discussed. Those are also in our podcast show notes, and to find links to purchase CEs. And speaking of CEs, I bet y'all want that second secret code word right now. And it is Goonies, Goonies. It's a group of children from the 80s who never say die. One of the Goonies just won an Academy Award.
That hug with Harrison Ford was so... I teared up.
I mean, I always loved Temple of Doom, folks. I've known this for a long time, all right?
Anyway.
Goonies. And if you're interested in even more ABA Inside Track content, why not subscribe on Patreon, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where you can get all of your episodes a week ahead of time. You can get discounts on CEs. You subscribe at the $5 level, you can get access to our quarterly live episodes. You get one free CE for watching those videos and seeing how the sausage gets made, I guess, with the podcast. And if you subscribe at our premium $10 level, you also get access to our quarterly book club podcast. Those are worth 2 CEs, and you get to hear way before everybody else an in-depth discussion of a book around a topic. And coming out very soon around this episode will be our discussion of the skeptical teaching book Calling Bullshit, discussing how data can lie to us, folks, and how people use information to lie to you, and how to be more skeptical as a reader and consumer of scientific literature and information. And then before we wrap up, I want to make sure we get to our last segment of the show, pairings.
Yay! Pairings. No, I don't have a song. Okay, so if you liked this episode and you want to think more about reinforcement, we have several that you might want to revisit. The first one is episode 47, in which we discuss social preference assessments. The next one is episode 137, in which we titled Advanced Preference Assessments, and talks about sort of different varieties. The next one I threw in there was episode 160, in which we discussed unique interests with Tamika Meadows, because I think that might be relevant to this discussion. Next, episode 183, Preference Assessment 2.0 with Chris Tullis. I also threw in there episode 195, which was our Token Economies 2.0 discussion with Jason Beret, because if we're thinking about reinforcers, we also should be thinking about conditioned reinforcers and how we might fade those over time. And finally, episode 205, Joy in the Big Four with Shala Alai Rosales, as we've had this discussion and thinking about sort of preventative strategies, ways in which you might hold off moving to those more restrictive settings and environments and reinforcers. That is a great episode to look at. And with our pairings, always, I recommend a snack to enjoy. In this episode, I was like, well, should it be a snack or should it be something else, right? Because we're moving away from edible. So I have 2 things to offer you. First thing is, I really love ranch dressing. That stuff is so good. I would put it on anything. But if you maybe don't want to just eat ranch dressing, you could have it with some carrots, right? So some carrots with ranch. But let's say you didn't want to eat anything at all. Then I would recommend you get the sweatshirt that I have my eye on, which just says in big letters, side of ranch, please. But it's a sweatshirt.
That's funny. I just saw a sweatshirt last night that said, I wet my plants.
What?
It's a picture of somebody watering their plants.
Oh.
Great.
It took me like 15 minutes to explain that to my 6-year-old. She read it on the shirt and she was, what? What? And I was like, that's funny.
You'll have to explain that to me off the air because I also don't quite get
Okay.
it. All right.
I'm going to buy it for you.
Oh, great. Just what I needed.
Pairings.
All right. Thank you, Diana. And some final thanks. Thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro, outro music, Kyle Sturry for our interstitial music, and Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his editing work. We'll be back next week with another full-length episode. But until then, keep responding.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.